Welcome to the Group Answers Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Daniel. This is the weekly show designed specifically for pastors, disciple makers, group pastors, and small group leaders. Truly, we are created to help anyone with bottom line responsibilities for discipleship. Our goal is simple: to resource, train, and encourage you in the vital work of discipleship. This is the Group Answers Podcast. Let's do it. Well, welcome to the show, Josh Spinks, all the way from Southeast Louisiana via Dallas, via somewhere in the Northwest. I think you were saying you've got some exposure going for you.
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. God has blessed me with an opportunity to see a lot in my few short years, although those years are not as few as they used to be.
All right, you've got your hands and feet, let's say, in several different things. So we'll talk about it more later in the show, but the Made to Multiply resource, you're a contributor to that out of the Lifeway Bible study team. You've got associations with I Am Second. You've got some relationships with discipleship.org and work with E3 partners. So just given the 2 decades or so experience that you've got in leadership, and am I right? Pastor, church planner. I mean, you've
Yes,
kind of run the gamut, and now I guess you would say more in vocational ministry.
yes, sir.
Let's start here. Let's start with an easy subject. Okay, so this unique perspective is a result of your role there and some other things. So let's talk about the world. Let's just jump in here. The human condition. All right. So Josh, this is the way that I'd like to set this up. And I'm interested in this because of your perspective. You know, like we were saying just a minute ago, before we started recording, you've got a macro perspective on discipleship that is, to some degree unique. So I would be interested in your response to who are we and how did we get here? Now, I want to short caveat: it's easy, maybe too easy, to cite all the problems that are out there. So I'm not really pushing us there, and I think you understand where I'm getting at here. But just a general question about the trajectory that we are on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for that question because it's one that we all, I think, in the Christian community should contemplate. And I think just having worked in the church in a ministerial position since I was 17 years old, and I'll be 42 this year. Man, what I've been able to observe is that the world that we live in, right, is not how God had designed it. We are broken. And we see that in our health. We see that in our homes. We see that in our behavior. We see it everywhere. And like you said, we don't want to belabor the point of what brokenness is. And the beauty of the gospel is that it has come to make all things new, to help us rise above that brokenness. However, what I've seen just in my time working with the church, and what I've seen is I've had an opportunity to really kind of serve in a bunch of different capacities over the years, is that the church a lot of times really bypasses how we can rise above the brokenness now by just talking about being above the brokenness in eternity. And the beauty of discipleship is when we invest in believers and really live out the Great Commission, right? Jesus said, "All authority given to me, both in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go make disciples." How did he tell us to do that? Baptize them and then to teach them to do everything that he commanded. When we start helping believers and invest in believers how to live like Jesus lived, they start to rise above that brokenness in their own life. They're still going to be touched by it. They're still going to experience it, but they start to see what it is to live as Christ above that brokenness through a disciple making relationship.
This idea of brokenness, which is not an idea, I mean, it's a reality. I mean,
For sure.
it's a gospel reality, it's a biblical reality, and I think it's not something a lot of people would take to task. But this idea of brokenness does not just resolve itself at conversion. I think we are open to it. Like, Paul exhorts us to wake, sleepers wake. And I think to some degree, I mean, there's a lot of ways you could take that, of course, in terms of application, but to be exposed to a truth that you were prior not exposed to. But I think in this respect, it is the healing quality of the gospel and of Jesus's ministry and mission. So, like, as you have devoted yourself to this conversation, let's call it, as you have, given considerable weight just to the process and the discipline of discipleship. How have you come to understand brokenness in that context? That it's I mean, you tell me if you agree or disagree, but it seems to be a through line that we are maybe, I think there's some degrees here, but never completely healed in this life. We're only being sanctified towards that. But then in that passing and in that transition to the hereafter, to be to be with Jesus for eternity, that's when the more fuller impact of this happens. But as you've thought about this, is that something that resonates with you and in your ministry, and as you have, like, let's say, initiated this conversation or this journey with that idea of brokenness?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Brokenness is it's all around us. It really is. It's our flesh, right? Our flesh is tapped into this brokenness around us, and so until Jesus comes back or He takes us home, we're not going to be fully separated from this brokenness. In fact, I think that's by design. When God rescued us from sin and he gave us his righteousness, he didn't zap us out of this brokenness, but he did so so that we could, first of all, learn what it is to live as Christ, learn what it is to to be salt and light in a place that is still tainted by it. And so, your question or your statement, I agree with that. We don't fully escape the brokenness because we still wear this flesh. We're still in this world that is fallen. But as we walk with the Lord, as we live in obedience to his commands and his word, what we start to see is that our life, through the renewing of our mind, begins to transform and we begin to live just above that brokenness and actually are able to serve those around us who are still experiencing the distraction and the derailing that brokenness brings into our life.
So you've been in ministry for more than a couple of decades, and like we've already said,
Yes,
it's
sir.
been in a few different capacities that has afforded you, a bit of a unique perspective on this. But in particular, I think you've taken this really deep, comprehensive dive into just to discipleship. So I would just be interested. So I've mentioned several times last season on the show, we were a lot more of a philosophical bent with some of our interviews and conversations and guests, and then this season we are really more in the praxis and the practical. But Josh, just real quick, how have you seen the conversation, the discipleship conversation, evolve over the course of your ministry?
I remember serving in the church in my early 20s, and I served in a denomination where we picked Sunday school teachers every fall, going into the fall of the school year. And man, it was extremely difficult to find somebody who was willing to step up and meet a certain criteria. And so I would attribute that to when we think about discipleship, especially in some of our organized denominations, the bar has been set extremely high of who can and who cannot effectively make disciples. But what you've seen over the really the last few years is that there is this real hunger and desire for people who come into the faith of how they can participate in the faith. And so the evolution that I've seen over the last 20 years is that there is this releasing of authority and empowering uh, the church, the people, to really step up and step into these spaces of making disciples, even if they may not have everything together, they may not have all the head knowledge, but there is a level of obedience that the church is really asking people to step into before they step into this, seminary degree, before they are able to make disciples. Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Yeah, it sounds like at least one of the things that you've seen is this decreasing centralization. That there
That's
used to
exactly
be
right.
this pillar of discipleship that you had to check some a bunch of boxes. You had to meet some standards before you could have the mantle of disciple maker placed on you, and it was a lot
That's
more of a
exactly right.
formal thing. To where now we've flattened it out. What you've seen is this more empowering, I think is the word that you use,
That's right.
of the different people to go and make disciples of on their own. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Well, yeah, and it's and more. in line with that, it's just organic. And so as we empower men and women to say, hey, everybody can be doing this and should be doing this, now people are, they feel as though they've been given the license. Now I can step into my home and be a disciple maker of my family. I can step into the gym where I have relationships and I can make disciples there. I don't necessarily have to fit inside of this particular box, but now if I have what I need, if I have what Jesus has given me, then I can step into these spaces and be obedient to what God's called us all to do, which is to multiply the faith, multiply disciple making, and ultimately just multiply leadership development across the church.
So in some respects, it seems like what we've done is given permission to take the walls down. In some respects,
Yeah, and what's crazy about that statement is Jesus already gave the permission, right? But somehow over the years, and that's just how movement works. Somehow over the years, we have relegated the responsibility of disciple making to an institution rather than where Jesus placed it, which is on the believer. And so it's a great point.
all right. What do we miss? Like, and here's the origin of this question. You know, when I look out at the landscape, you know, you kind of wet your finger and stick it in the air and get a sense on which way the air is blowing. It just feels like that there is a missing piece or component of this in the mechanics somewhere. I would be interested, like, as you go about your ministry, what what are the misses that you're picking up on? Um, and I think this question really has more to do with us as individuals and our understanding of what disciples is more than the institutional church.
Yeah, and so that's a great question because I think if you were to look at some of the studies that have come out, in fact, Lifeway put one out a couple of years ago that less than 10% of the evangelical church is sharing their faith more than once a month. Now, if you were to do a study and to look at how many people are making disciples, right? I would imagine that that number is critically lower, right? And I think it's because for a very long time in our traditions as the church, especially in the West, we have put a very high value on knowledge based discipleship, right? You need to know your faith. It's just like what you were talking about a while ago. Last season, it was a philosophical understanding of what disciple making is. And so it's a head knowledge of what disciple making is. And so the church has put a great amount of value on knowing your faith, knowing your faith, knowing your faith. However, what we have missed out on is how do we practice our faith? How can we not just know our faith, but execute on our faith? And so I believe what's missing in a lot of believers is they may have a desire to participate in making a disciple, but there's just not a lot of know-how. There's not some simple tools. There's not a simple pathway for them to track down so that they could be successful on this journey. And so what typically happens is they look at their pastors, they look at their small group leaders and say, hey, they've got it figured out. So I'm going to hand that responsibility off to them for making disciples. And then I will just be a consumer of my faith rather than a contributor to. And so I think that's one of the biggest missing elements when it comes to the church really participating in this endeavor to multiply disciples.
Everything in me is just wanting to ask you now. So why is that? Um, I- it I've mentioned it a lot in other episodes, but I was in a conversation a few years ago, and you know I was having a similar conversation with a coworker at Lifeway, and one of the things we landed on, I remember where we were. It's just funny how that happens, and you know I remember thinking, you know, I think we've lost the capacity to be a serious people, to consider what Jesus may have referred to as the weightier matters. I would I would be interested in your take on this. Why isn't it I I feel like I have an answer, but why isn't the matter of discipleship and being in disciple making relationships and disciple making conversations to be in more meaningful conversations, to have discourse with anyone in your circle that is more of a greater substance and outside, those concentric circles where you get into something I would just call trivia.
Mhm.
There's absolutely nothing wrong with talking about last night's game or the political world that we live in. That's just part of being human. But I think you should also have, in turn, the more meaningful conversations about who we are and where we're going and matters of eternity, or the existential questions that are out there. So, I mean, how do you address that? Why don't we take things more seriously? Why isn't this conversation more of a priority in the orientation of a disciple's life than what it apparently is?
So I think there are probably several contributing factors to that gap that you have observed in the Christian community. I think there is, for one, the reason we don't enter into those conversations a lot of times is because there's just a lack of confidence, right? I'm not going to talk to you about, I don't know, astrophysics because I have no idea what I'm talking about, right? So I want to talk to you about things that I know and that I can actually be interesting about. And so I think there's a lack of confidence from the Christian community to really get into a conversation. And if you have any kind of objection, well, I don't know how to respond to that. So I think that that may contribute somewhat to maybe a lackluster approach to having some spiritual conversations that are meaningful, that are life changing. I would also say that I believe that there are some lackluster approaches to having some spiritual conversations because
Hmm.
we lack intentionality, right? If I'm going to have a spiritual conversation with Brian, then that's a weighty conversation. So I am not necessarily just going to jump into that conversation on accident. I'm not going to accidentally just start bringing up how God changed my life. I was this. This is what happened, and now this is how I live my life. As we're kind of shooting the breeze at a ball game. But instead, I need to be a lot more intentional. It's not to say that I can't get into that conversation and we can't have a spiritual conversation, but I need to make sure that Brian is a friend of mine. I believe Brian could benefit from the hope that Jesus brings. So, when can I purposefully run my life into his life so that we can have an in-depth conversation? And that may take place at a ball game, but a lot of times it's going to be inviting Brian and his family over to my house. A lot of times that's going to be, hey, let's go get some coffee and let's talk about life. But if you were to look at your schedule, look at my schedule, man, it is packed from Sunday to Saturday. And if we're going to get into those conversations, not only do we need to be intentional, but we also need to die to our calendars. We need to make some space in our life to make sure that this is a priority for the lostness that exists around us. Well, I mean, what would your thoughts be on that?
Here's a statement for you. I can't take or lead someone on a journey that I am not on myself.
Oh, that's good. That is good, brother. Yeah.
I wonder how many of us have really been discipled. That's where I land. I mean, I'm going through with some family members, um, some some circumstances now that have really prompted me to take a step back and go, what are we doing now? Um, how are we not equipping the saints to lead people on the journey that they are supposed to be on? And that's kind of where my question about what are we missing comes from. But I would say, I don't know that we really challenge ourselves as disciples, as individuals, and really put ourselves on the journey and in the path of God's revelatory presence in our lives. And I think you hit on it. I think there's just a lot of competing things these days. We surviving, just mere survivalship is not difficult now. I mean, sure, life is. I'm not saying life is easy, but it's moved away from the physical demands and a lot more towards like emotional, mental demands. I mean, we very few of us are worried about actually surviving to tomorrow, and I think we've lost some gravity about what life is in that transition. So I just wonder how many of us are actually on the disciples' journey is what it comes down to, and that's a an honest question. I'm certainly
Yeah.
not taking a shot. I just wonder. That's what I wonder.
No, and it also makes you wonder what has contributed to that, right? What has really given that that attitude or that posture to discipleship to the Christian community at large in the West? Just a nonchalant approach to their faith. And because at the end of the day, if there is no intentionality in being discipled or no intentionality in making disciples, you will never be discipled. And unfortunately, what happens is because it goes back to what you said about centralization of our faith being in a building, right? And every aspect of our faith, right? The community that we build usually happens at the church. The worship that we offer, we usually connect that to what happens at a church. Any kind of discipleship endeavors that we want to embark on usually happens at that church, and everything is centralized here. And if we could figure out how to decentralize that, I do believe that disciple making and discipleship becomes a lot more accessible to the people around us. And it starts to seen as something that doesn't happen inside of a building, but happens in my day to day life. It is a lifestyle. And so, man, I think you make a fantastic point there.
There's an obscure reference in Amos, and I don't remember where it is, but this is the prophet Amos is speaking to the priestly community of I don't remember if it's Northern Kingdom or Southern Kingdom. I should know that. Alas, I do not. But he says, "Assemble yourselves on the mountains of Samaria and look at the tumult below. They are a people that do not even know how to do right." And that's just one of those things. It's like, Josh, you read certain things that are kind of obscure, but they stick with you. That's always been one of those things for me, that it's not that they don't want to be a people of God. It's not that they don't have a desire to know God more. They don't know how.
That's right.
Something's been lost. Just thought that was, and I think maybe there are elements of that we're kind of picking around in this conversation.
And not to belabor this point, but I think that vision is a big part of that. If you don't understand the purpose for your life, if you don't and if you don't embrace that, then it is really easy and tempting to make your life about something other than what Jesus made it about. And so if it goes back to all the distractions, the world is going to really fight for your time. But as we begin to understand our purpose, then living on this discipleship journey and living with a disciple making posture, I think we begin to embrace it more. And like I said, it becomes accessible to many folks around us.
It's pretty interesting to think. Here's a what if question: what if the mission begins in Eden and not in Matthew? How does that? I mean, how does that maybe change the way that we approach this conversation? All right, so we have. All right, so we've talked about we've kind of articulated the need. We've talked about this macro level in terms of the tools that are out there. I think it's a good. I'd like to talk just for a few minutes just about Made to Multiply. So you're a contributor to Lifeway's Made to Multiply. It's a study created in collaboration with I Am Second, which is a pretty big deal. So talk to us about that resource for churches and your hope for it, and just in it, and you're part of that, and how you see that plan out, and how that resource and that tool can be used like in this dynamic that we've been talking about.
What we have got to figure out how to do, right, is yes, we want to know our faith. There needs to be an element of knowledge based discipleship. But there also has to be, just as important, an element of obedience-based discipleship or knowing how to practice our faith. And with this Made to Multiply study that we were able to put together for Lifeway, the endeavor or the hope was, hey, we want to give you some content that is helpful for broadening your understanding. But at the same time, we want to put some practical, easy tools in your hand that could help you live out your faith the very next day. And so as you peruse through the study, what you'll notice there are several tools that are given, and each one of those tools meet three criteria. The first criteria is going to meet is that it's biblical. It's biblical so that God can use it. If it's not in the Bible, then why should we use it? The second criteria is that it is going to be simple so that I can use it. If this redneck from South Louisiana can't use it, right, then we need to think of something else. So every tool that you'll see in there is simple. Even a young child can reproduce a lot of these tools that you will find in the Made to Multiply study. And then thirdly, it has to be reproducing so that the people that I pour into, the disciples that I'm trying to make, they can use it. And so this study is really an effort to help the church uh, give them some handles for sharing their story, sharing God's story, and multiplying disciples.
How is it, in your opinion, has it different from other resources that have been created for the same thing? I mean, this is not a new endeavor. So what makes Made to Multiply unique and maybe different? And hopefully, because things made today are built on the things of yesterday, hopefully it improves on things that have been done.
Again, there is nothing that you're going to read in this study that is going to be earth-shattering information for you or revelation that you have not stumbled upon yourself as you've walked with the Lord over the years. The hope is with this particular study is that an emphasis on the training side of things so that you can multiply prayer, multiply gospel shares, multiply disciple making. But fourthly, is so that you will multiply the establishment of these groups. This study is meant to start with this group and then you start another group and then you start another so that you are multiplying these practical skills across your church and hopefully across the lost community in which your church is planted. And so, again, unique in understanding. No, these are all things that are simple. That I might have put a little flavor on it that comes from Josh's personality. But at the end of the day, these are not brand new ideas. These are ideas that the church has embraced for years. But the emphasis on practicing your faith with these simple biblical reproducing tools, I believe, gives the Made to Multiply study a little uniqueness.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you is we don't want to dumb things down. You don't want to make things overly easy. In fact, I think the times warrant another approach that we actually this is a season where we should demand more of ourselves
Sure.
and the people in our congregations. But I understand those implications. But that's what I was gonna ask you is in terms of accessibility, Made to Multiply feels like it's something that I could look at and go, oh, well, I could do that. That's something I could do. It's not so high minded or like heavy handed. It's like, oh gosh, you're asking me to do a seminary course here. It feels like it's something that is I wouldn't call it low bar, but I would call it accessible. And yet it sounds like you would agree with that.
Absolutely. And I think disciple making, we complicate it, right? Jesus did not complicate the art of multiplying disciples. He said, go and teach them everything that I've commanded you. That's a pretty simple thing to do. I believe in our context today, the reason one reason why a lot of our folks are not multiplying disciples is because the bar has been set so high on what it means to make disciples. And what this study helps us do is just put it where Jesus put the bar. That does not mean that we water down sin. No, we're not saying uh, that at all. In fact, you will find that if you can be a disciple maker, then there is an expectation that you are a disciple maker. So I would say that with this study, with it being at a shelf that everybody can reach, also comes with a responsibility for everyone who can reach it, that everyone should participate, that there is an expectation. And this study helps put that expectation on everybody so that the church can raise to shoulder height in this endeavor to expand God's kingdom across our neighborhoods.
And I would just add to this, this is not something that we would advocate as your 100% solution to your discipleship. That is not what this is.
Oh, no, no, sir. No,
This
sir.
is a flashpoint. And
That's
so, in an
exactly right.
environment that's right for mobilization, for those situations, you're like, what's a next step that we can take? This is a little bit of a culture builder that the made to multiply resource, like Josh has said, this is about multiplying groups and multiplying ministry. This is this is something that is initiated in perpetuity. That would be the vision of this. This is not something you do for 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and then you're like, all right, what do we do next? This is a tool of culture, of a gospel centered discipleship, disciple making culture. So I would just point that out. And
Absolutely.
again, the resource is made to multiply, and anywhere, I just Google it. It's what I would do. But you can certainly go to lifeway.com to find out more information, or just about anywhere that you would buy anything. And we would recommend that. So before we wrap up here, tell us a little bit about the work of E3 Partners and just your role with that. I think there's probably some
Yeah.
people out there that'd like to know more.
So E3 Partners is a church planting organization. We have strategy in about 100 countries around the world. And so every day we wake up with the idea of seeing God's glory extended to the ends of the earth through the church that He established. And so we work day in and day out to see that everybody everywhere has access to a healthy, transformative church. What we noticed over the last 5 years is we've seen over 500,000 churches planted. But here in the US, we have contributed not even a sliver of those numbers, right? And so E3 has poured a lot of time and energy into helping come alongside of the local church and add lift to what their vision is for that community by offering training and offering coaching and offering resources to really help the leaders of those church really equip the body of Christ for the work of the Lord. And so, man, I train from sea to shining sea. And I am second is under the parent organization. E3 is our digital ministry. And so I get to contribute to I am second and how it helps the individual believer get to shoulder height and multiplying disciples and multiplying disciple making.
So check it out. That's E3 Partners, and also the Made to Multiply resource. Again, you can find out more about that. Just I'd go to lifeway.com. And that's going to wrap it up for our time today. Thank you so much to Josh Spinks. Appreciate you taking time out. I'd like to also thank our executive producer, Angie Elkins, producer Nikki Ogden, and engineer Donnie Gordon. That's going to wrap it up for this episode of the Group Answers Show. Thank you so much for being with us. Group Answers is a production of the Lifeway Podcast Network. Executive producer Angie Elkins, edited by Colin Cruz, and engineered by Donnie Gordon. Produced by Nikki Ogden. And I'm your host, Brian Daniel. Group Answers is recorded at the Lifeway Podcast Studios in Brentwood, Tennessee, and in my personal studio in Evergreen, Colorado, with the help of Riverside.fm. On behalf of the Group Answers team, thank you for listening. I will meet you right back here next week with another episode of Group Answers.